guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do another swatch and review video, and this time I'm going to be doing it on the Morphe 35O palette. Now you may have seen previously that I did a swatch and review video on the Morphe 35T palette, and that's more of a slightly cooler tone palette with loads of kind of purples and taupes, but this is very much a warm toned palette. So if you want to see each of the 35 shadows up close and personal, then just keep watching. I am going to start from the first row. Now this first shade is a matte shade. Oh, and that feels really smooth. This is a kind of off-white shade, just a basic shade that you could use to highlight your brow bone or to use as an all over the lid shade. I mean, it's got a very ever so slight hint of warmth to it. I guess that ties it back in with the rest of the palette, which is just full of warm tones anyway. Okay, moving on to the second shade, and this one looks like it has a bit more of a satin finish. Again, it's very kind of smooth and soft to the touch, and this has an ever so slight peachy hint to it. It's not intense at all, and this would also actually make a nice brow bone highlight because it is kind of light enough. Okay, moving on to the third shade, and this has a definite metallic sheen to it. It looks quite peachy as well. Even though it's got a peachy tone to it, it's not so intense. It almost looks like a white with a hint of peach to it. This would make a beautiful inner corner highlight. Okay, now moving on to the fourth shade along, and you're getting a bit deeper in tone now, and again it's another metallic finish, and this is a really kind of warm and a vibrant orange tone with a really strong metallic sheen running through it, kind of reminiscent to the tones of the leaves that are changing colour at this time of year. Moving on to the fifth shade along, we're back to our matte textures, and this looks like it would make a great transition colour. For lighter skin tones, this would probably work nice as a crease shade, but those with kind of a bit more medium type skin tones, this would work really nice as a warm transition shade. Right, then the second to last shade in the first row, again it's another matte shade. It actually reminds me of Makeup Geek's Desert Sands, or I think it's MAC Uninterrupted, but this has definitely more of a kind of sandy, mustardy tone to it. Then moving on to the last shade of the first row, we've got a very intense bright orange matte shade. Wow, the pigmentation on the matte shades are incredible. I mean, this is just a full-on vibrant orange matte shade. Nothing more to say about it. It's very intense, but the texture is really kind of soft and smooth, and like with the other Morphe eyeshadows that I own, the matte shades blend superbly well. God, I don't know where that word came from, but it blends incredibly well is what I'm trying to say. Moving on to the second row now, and this is a bit more of a lemon sorbet kind of shade. This is a kind of off-white shade with a hint of lemon. This would work nicely as another kind of highlighting shade, so great for the brow bone. Then the second shade along, we have a metallic shade. It looks kind of like a golden peach shade in the pan, but on your skin there's a kind of slight pink shift to it. In that sense, it's a bit of a duochrome eyeshadow, so two shades in one. That is a really unique colour. I've never come across a colour like this before. Moving on to the third shade along, I have a feeling that this might also be a duochrome shade. It looks like a kind of another kind of peachy shade in the pan, but this one's got a golden shift running through it. Duochrome is everywhere on my social media since the launch of Makeup Geek's duochrome pigments and eyeshadows, which I've just kind of ordered a whole lot. So as soon as I get them, I'll definitely do another swatch and review video on here. So the fourth shade along in the second row, we're back to the mattes. So I'd say it again, it's a light brown but a very peachy brown. It's probably more peach than brown. It would work really, really nice as a transition shade. Then moving on to the fifth shade along, it's more of a mid-tone peachy orange shade. It's not as orange as the matte orange shade we saw in the first row. Definitely a lot more kind of wearable. Blended out well, it would just add that nice kind of hint of warmth to the eyes, which I absolutely love. And then moving on to the second to last shade in the second row. This is definitely more of a brown shade, but it's still kind of a very much warm brown shade, kind of camely brown. This would be a much more darker transition shade or more of a crease shade if you're kind of more lighter in skin tones. And then finally we're finishing off with a matte shade, and it's another orange matte shade. This is definitely more orange than any of the previous matte tones in that second row, but if you still wanted that orange tone but not as deep or as intense, then this one's a nice one to go with. We're starting off with a matte shade. This is more on the tan side as opposed to kind of orange, but another beautiful shade and one that I definitely I'm going to be using loads of things. Right, then the second shade in the third row, this is more of a kind of stone pebbly type of brown shade. There's a definite element of like grey to this brown, which is a nice alternative because you might not be wanting a warm eye, you might want more of a neutral tone eye or slightly more cooler. So I like the fact that it gives you, even though when you look at this palette you do see, wow, a lot of warm tones, but if you look carefully there are a lot more cooler tones at the bottom, which is nice. Moving on to the third shade of the third row, and this is a lot more deeper than any of the tones that we've seen so far. And it is another very cool tone shade, but this is more of a dark brown and would work nice as a crease shade or a shade just to kind of smoke things up if you're going for more of a smoky eye. Moving on to the fourth shade, and we're back to our warm tones, and it's another matte shade. This is a kind of, I say it's almost like a brick red brown. It's very, very warm. It reminds me of Makeup Geek Cocoa Bear or MAC Swiss Chocolate, if you're familiar with those tones. A really, really beautiful, warm, dark brown shade. Moving on to the fifth shade along, and it's a very similar shade to the last colour that we just swatched. Yeah, this is definitely more of a semi-metallic slash satin shade, and the metallic sheen is not that prominent. It's a mix of kind of terracotta and copper with a bit of brown thrown in. So the next shade along is one of 3 or 4 shades that are super metallic in this palette, and it's quite hard to see what the actual colour is because there's such a high amount of intense metallicness going on in this shade. It actually swatches more white than what you see in the pan. It reminds me of Makeup Geek in the Spotlight. That is a very highly frosted peachy shade. There is just a very subtle hint of peachiness to this tone, and that would absolutely look incredible on the inner corners or maybe in the center part of the lid, just so that it catches the light and really makes your eyes pop. And then moving on to the last shade of the third row, and it's quite similar to the intense matte orange shade that we swatched in the first row, but this looks like it's slightly more of a red orange as opposed to the other one, which was more of a true orange. And moving on to the fourth row, we're starting off with a satin shade this time. This is another cool tone brown, and it's got a very slight sheen to it. It's quite similar to one of the matte shade that we swatched in the third row, but obviously this has a satin finish to it. Now here's another really intense highly frosted metallic shade. It's definitely more of a gold as opposed to a brown, but it's such a dark, deep, muted, dirty type of gold shade, slightly antique-y. And moving on to the third shade along, it's a very, very, very dark brown, but there's almost like a slate grey coolness running through it. It's a nice alternative to black if you don't have black or you don't want to use black, because Black can be sometimes quite intense and sometimes quite harsh. Then the fourth shade along in that fourth row, again sticking with the coolness. This is another cool tone brown, but it's more of a kind of mid to dark tone brown. This is slightly more lighter. Then the fifth shade in the fourth row is a metallic shade, and it's a kind of mid to dark tone brown, definitely more of a bronzy brown, bit more warmer. It's a slight readiness to it. It actually reminds me of MAC Sable, I want to say. And moving on to the sixth shade along in the fourth row, this is a more of a mid-tone, kind of a peachy orange shade. It's got such a nice texture to it as well. You know that it's just going to be such a dream to work with. Definitely a shade that I would say screams fall or autumn. And then the last shadow of the fourth row is a bit more of a kind of burnt brick reddish brown shade. It's got a slight terracotta feel to it. Moving on to the final and fifth row of this palette, we're starting with a kind of sparkly dark shade, and this is a really dark cool tone brown with golden flecks of glitter running through it. I mean, the glitter is quite fine, so it's not like big chunky specks of glitter. They don't transfer that much when swatching. You do kind of get the odd spark here and there. I think it could potentially be the darkest shadow in this palette. Right, then moving on to the second shade of the last row, and this is more of a mid to dark brown, and I'd say it's more of a neutral shade, not too cool, not too warm. Then the third shade along is another really dark brown shade. Again, it's more of a neutral tone, so it's almost the darker version of the previous shade. Right, then fourth shade along, this is another mid to dark tone brown. It's kind of more on the neutral side, but slightly with a bit more warmth than the last two shades we've just swatched. And then we're back to a very, very cool kind of slatish brown shade. Yep, this is definitely more of a dark grey. I don't know if it's a dark grey or is it dark brown, but a kind of combination of the two. And moving on to the penultimate shade is a really intense red orange shade, and it's a metallic finish, and wow, that is such an incredible shade. It is almost like the metallic version of this shade that we swatched in the third row. Almost like a fiery kind of orange shade. It's not quite red, but it's definitely more than just an orange shade. And then the final shadow is this spectacular, highly metallic, kind of coppery orange shade. This is probably one of my favourite colours of this palette, I think. It's definitely a very warm, deep copper shade, and this is what autumn is all about. Compared to the other two palettes that I own, the Morphe 35T and the Jaclyn Hill Favourites palette, this palette definitely has a lot more matte tones in it and a lot more transitional tones as well. In my experience, often a lot of palettes carry a lot of like metallic or shimmery tones and a lot of dark tones. There's never quite enough light to mid-tone transitional shades, and in this palette you've got plenty of them. At an initial glance you think, wow, this is a really warm palette, but if you actually look really closely, there are actually a lot of cool tones in this palette, as well as a few neutral tones in there. I really love the three highly kind of almost foiled textured eyeshadows that they've got in here. A little goes a long way. If you pick up too much product, you do run the risk of fallout, because they're really soft. If you just go in with a light hand and kind of build up to the intensity that you want, then you shouldn't really experience too much fallout. If you enjoyed watching this swatch and review video of the Morphe 35O palette, then please give me a thumbs up, and if you're new around these sides, then I'd love it if you subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!